Well, thank you for inviting me. Today, I want to focus on wetland systems found higher in the watershed and what the possible ramifications may be with changes in the hydrologic factors due to projected climate change. Thus, I will touch upon defining headwater zones, what to expect, some watershed implications, and mitigation measures. So today's talk will focus on flowing headwater wetlands within a watershed. Traditionally, these were described as including first and second order streams. Studies have shown that headwater streams comprise upwards to 70% of the linear length of a river basin. However, these can be better characterized as upper perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral, with the most hydrologically variable being the ephemeral or intermittent. Now, ephemeral streams flow during and soon after precipitation inputs and have no groundwater inputs or a real base flow. Intermittent streams flow continuously only at certain times a year when the water table intersects the surface along the channel course, such as when the stream receives water from a spring or from a surface source, such as melting snow. Perennial streams are commonly characterized by continuous flow. There are other non-flowing headwater wetlands, but these are not the focus of today's discussion. Now, commonly used maps of river networks, developed often from 10-meter DEMs, do not adequately represent channel heads, which is the ephemeral zone, and which are typically not visible in aerial imagery and are difficult and time-consuming to map in the field. Consequently, many investigators assume that the channel heads, the ephemeral zone, lies near reversals or inflections in average hillside slopes as seen on a topographic map. Now, commonly used maps in talking about the ephemeral zone is primarily the area driven by runoff from rain or snowmelt. The saturation in flowing water is fleeting and may end within hours of an event. However, during the time, sediment and carbon can be moved by the flowing water, and such things as partially decomposed leaves can move down watershed with the flow. Now, the ability for obligate aquatic organisms to survive is quite limited in this zone. As such, the richness and diversity of species is primarily driven by terrestrial life. Intermittent streams are often indicated by dashed lines, but where along this section of drainage the continuous flow begins is difficult to ascertain from aerial photogrammetry. The intermittent zone has longer duration of flows, but are also flashy in nature, with flows not being maintained through the growing season. There may be some of the stream maintained by a shallow water table or even shallow bedrock fractures known as sheet joints. The water table and sheet joint flow will cease shortly after some contributing precipitation event and can be greatly influenced by evapotranspiration of the surrounding forested vegetation. The obligate aquatic organisms that survive in the zone have life cycles adapted to short hydro periods. This is primarily true for macroinvertebrates such as the stonefly. However, one may see upward watershed migration of aquatic vertebrates during flow. The abundance and diversity of aquatic species in this zone is also low. But due to the alteration between an aquatic and terrestrial phase within the channels, on an annual basis, the overall species richness and diversity is high within this zone. Now, the perennial system has continuously flowing water, but within the upper perennial zone, there may be certain times of the year that the flow may be so shallow or even drop below the surface of the stream channel that one spatially sees the stream corridor with isolated deeper pools of water with only marginal aquatic connectivity between them. The depth of flow in this upper perennial zone are influenced by deeper water tables and fractures that have a larger capacity for storing and releasing water over a longer period of time during the growing season. As a result, there is a greater likelihood of base flow and connectivity, which can be maintained throughout the season, and which will contribute to the overall resilience of aquatic organisms within the riparian corridor. Now, the main climatic drivers that impact sustainability of these systems at this specific elevation on the landscape is precipitation, temperature, and the resulting evapotranspiration. And these climatic factors naturally fluctuate, not only daily, but obviously seasonally and interannually. And there are longer fluctuations that are driven by the interaction of the ocean and atmospheric currents, such as the 7 to 9 year wet dry cycles in our area associated with the La Nina and El Nino dynamic. As a result, there is a corresponding variance in runoff coming down the watershed over time. But this is expected within a minimum and maximum based on historic records. So, what have we seen in regards to climate parameters? This information is well documented in the scientific literature, but this information has now been translated into user-friendly formats through a number of publications. To summarize some of these findings that will pertain to this headwater zone, there is, over the last century, average annual temperature has increased at the first Connecticut lake by 1.5 degrees approximately. In the Northeast, winters have been warming 3 times faster than the summers. Snow-covered days have generally decreased with a rate of approximately 2 days per decade over the last 100 years. Over the last century, the majority of runoff coming down the watershed has occurred 20 days sooner. The late winter, early spring temperatures are increasing with a corresponding tree leaf out occurring 10 days earlier since 1981. And for northern New England, the length of the growing season has on average increased 26 days since 1960. And since 1970, at the first Connecticut lake, average annual precipitation has increased almost 7 inches. But over the same period, winter average annual precipitation has decreased by approximately 1/2 inch. And since 1958, extreme precipitation events have increased by 55%. However, over the last century, northern New Hampshire has seen an increase in the frequency and intensity of short-term droughts. So what may be happening? The red reflects impacts of temperature based on current greenhouse gas loading into the future. The blue is a more optimistic projection. However, average maximum temperatures will inevitably increase for both scenarios. The largest increases in the summers are in the summer season for both the higher emissions and the optimistic emissions. And we're talking roughly by the end of the century, possibly an increase of around 10 degrees Fahrenheit for the average annual summer season. Now, with increasing temperature worldwide, one will see an increase of both evaporation and evapotranspiration by vegetation, resulting in more moisture transfer to the atmosphere. Thus, we will see an increase in average annual precipitation into the future for both scenarios. And when it rains, one will see higher occurrence of more extreme storm precipitation events. Now, changes in future snow cover will depend on both temperature and precipitation. Precipitation is expected to increase in winter and spring, potentially increasing total snowfall over the near-term few decades, as long as the precipitation occurs when the temperature is below freezing. However, later in the century, the influence of warming winter and spring temperatures will dominate over expected increase in winter precipitation. This means that the number of snow-covered days is projected to decrease for the rest of the century under both greenhouse gas emissions. And we will also see an increase in the growing season. This translates to longer time periods for the evapotranspiration by vegetation of soil water. And at the same time, we will see an increase of frequency and intensity of droughts. In short, there will be longer periods between precipitation events, but when it does occur, the precipitation will be more intense than we see today. So what does this all mean? For the zone we're looking at, temperatures will be warmer and thus increased heating of waters and increased evaporation will occur in the headwater zone. Earlier, warmer winters means increased runoff when ground is frozen, reducing infiltration of water that reaches the water table. Warmer winter temperatures mean more rain or snow events, reducing the snowpack and thus reducing the duration of the runoff into the early spring. Early vegetation leaf out extends the period of vegetation mitigated evapotranspiration, potentially lowering the water table earlier in the year. And a longer growing season increases the likelihood of loss of soil moisture and thus potentially lowering the water table overall. And the increase in the frequency and intensity of droughts will reduce both superficial and groundwater contributions to stream flow. So spatially, what does this mean? This climatic future foretells that there will be reduced annual flow of water in the higher watershed, resulting in a downward watershed movement of where continuous flow will first occur. For the aquatic system, there will be ramifications from losing specific headwater habitats, impacting not only aquatic obligate species, but also impacting the surrounding terrestrial species abundance and richness. But downslope shift of these headwater zones can also have extended ramifications for the entire watershed. Loss of small stream species would also reduce basin or region-wide diversity of some taxonomic groups. For example, at least 20% of the stonefly species in eastern North America exclusively are found in headwater zones. Now, highest in the aquatic watershed, the top consumer are amphibians. And ecologically, it's been shown the presence or absence of such a top predator can change the entire associated food web and species abundance and diversity, not only of the aquatic habitat, but also the associated terrestrial habitat as well. Now, of the 47 salamander species found in the US, 7 salamander genera in North America are specifically adapted to conditions found in headwater streams. And the 3 species most common in New Hampshire are the spring, the two-line, and the northern dusky salamander. They are in the family of lungless salamanders. Oxygen is absorbed across the moist skin of these species. Thus, they must keep their skins in a habitat that is moist. These salamanders require well-oxygenated water. The immature larvae take at least 3 years to mature to the point that they can emerge from the stream to surrounding moist forest stuff. Now, prefer stream bottoms with woody debris and cobble-sized stone allow salamanders to find its needed cover. Now, this study by Lowe and Bolger in New Hampshire headwater streams, focusing on the spring salamander, showed that salamanders' abundance can be influenced by the presence of fish and the type of stream bottom. With fish in predation, we see less abundance of salamanders, and with a bottom of fine particle sediments where there is less cover, it impacts the population of salamanders also. Now, salamanders can move higher into the headwater streams than fish because physical attributes of the streams, such as intermittent hydrology, small size and shallowness of pools, and the height of cascades and waterfalls, all can limit the ability of fish to access the higher headwater areas. As such, headwater streams offer these salamanders an attractive ecological niche free from the fish predation. However, both salamanders and fish, especially brook trout, will need to survive projected drier periods of flow by staying to deeper waters. Now, because the frequency and intensity of the loss of flow will be in the higher reaches of the watershed, salamanders will disproportionately need to migrate downstream. And they may only find refuge from the drying in the geomorphologic zone of the deeper and larger pools that also support fish during dry periods. This brings the salamanders into habitats where predation can reduce the species abundance in the upper watershed zone. Now, returning to Lowe and Bolger's study, they actually looked at a third factor that impacts salamanders. And what they looked at is the configuration of channelized stream networks. In short, the more branching of the streams, the higher likelihood for salamander survival. In short, linearity of a stream channel networks can increase the vulnerability of the metapopulation of obligate aquatic populations by reducing connectivity. For example, where population C is found, it may be due to specifics of geology, soils, and groundwater, such that this area in the watershed will dry out sooner than the branches where population A and B are found. This loss in connectivity to the unique genotypic reserve found in population C degrades the resilience of the overall metapopulation of the species, making it more vulnerable to disturbance. So, as the effective headwater zones shift lower in the watershed, one will see a decrease in both the overall length of the flow and a shift of dendritic patterns to more of linear flow, thus impacting the resilience of the metapopulations of obligate aquatic species. Now, another impact of flow initiation moving down watershed is that there will be a shift to a different geomorphic zone. Lower in the watershed, the riparian zone has a wider defined channel with less vegetation, which is seen at the bottom here, where more light is reaching the stream. And as a result, water temperatures will increase. And with increased water temperature, correspondingly, water oxygen content is reduced, thus stressing cold water obligate species. For example, this study shows the impact on headwater salamanders. The y-axis, likelihood of occurrence of northern two-line salamander. The x-axis, water temperature. Based on the study, 55 degrees Fahrenheit is an optimal temperature for these organisms. A similar impact is seen for cold water fish such as brook trout, which are found higher in the watershed also. Now, if the headwater stream zone is pushed further downslope, there may be ramifications that will reverberate all the way down the river basin. Now, one important dynamic to be impacted is the contribution of carbon source to the riparian zone. This carbon is the basis for the river basin's food web's energy. In the upper watershed, aquatic macroinvertebrates are the first order consumers that transform vegetative matter into a form of carbon that moves down the watershed with the flow of water. This carbon is the basis of energy that supports the aquatic and associated riparian ecosystems. Higher in the watershed, the riparian zone is quite narrow, with overhanging vegetation that allows input of terrestrially derived carbon into the aquatic system. Further down the watershed, with wider riparian zones, the resultant reduction of overhanging vegetation combined with increased light reaching the stream channel, the productivity of carbon shifts to an internal photosynthesis-based carbon source. Thus, productivity, carbon additions, particularly in the forested landscapes, generally increases along the river continuum from headwaters to larger rivers, with the upper watershed mainly receiving terrestrially derived materials such as leaf fall, and the lower watershed from photosynthesis of algae, both attached and within the water column. However, the large aggregate length of headwater streams means that even though the local production of carbon may be relatively low, headwaters still contribute a substantial proportion of total river system productivity. Now, with the movement of headwaters down slope, larger areas of potential terrestrial derived carbon additions and decomposition are removed as the habitats supporting these carbon transforming microorganisms are lost. Now, since current headwater zones make up 70% of the linear length of a river basin, any downward shift in the headwater zone will have a significant impact on the entire river energy system. So, what actions should we be taking? One is to identify habitat and refuge during dry periods. These are areas with deeper pools that can maintain cooler, oxygenated waters during the projected increased frequency of intermittent flow. And we should consider at minimum 30-foot buffers, which is about how far an obligate aquatic salamander needs to be maintained. Another thing is minimizing impervious surface, so that we can store more of the precipitation in soils and associated water tables. Now, with impervious surface, there is less infiltration and a resultant rapid, flashy runoff of the water, which will also impact the depth of flow of the streams throughout the year. Now, forest practices also should take into account both the location and potential aquatic refuges. as well as to ensure both maximum vegetated cover to maintain stream base flows and minimize sediment loading into headwater streams. Such sediment additions both increase biological and chemical oxygen demand, degrading the environment for many aquatic organisms, and it also blankets possible stony bottoms with finer sediments, reducing cover for specific aquatic species. This is a hydrograph that's very similar to what we see with impervious surface, that with clear cut, you're going to get more flashy runoff and base flow will be reduced downstream. A similar impact is from historical trails that had been sited to move up the watershed along the stream channels. The overuse and degradation of such recreation corridors can have similar impact on loading sediments into headwater areas. Now, what I haven't addressed is the isolated vernal pools higher in the watershed. They will be facing many of the same pressures because they have similarly short duration of standing water. However, they may be more vulnerable than other headwater flowing streams because often these things are not fed with groundwater. And some of these pools will succumb to a drier climate, and it will reduce the overall metapopulation of the specialized adaptive species that use these pools, due to reducing the connectivity between viable pool habitats due to the distances exceeding species dispersals. So loss of just a couple of pools can result in large loss of habitat for specially adapted vernal pool species. But this talk is for a different time. There will be a publication coming out shortly in the newsletter for the New Hampshire Association of Natural Resource Scientists, where this information will be presented and all citations will be noted. So thank you for your attention.